Thanks for coming along tonight, folks, where Alexander Downer makes a very welcome return to the Sydney Institute. He was here as a minister, and Tony Parkinson, a first-time appearance. I'll introduce our speakers very briefly on the occasion of the book by Tony Parkinson, A Step to the Right, The Life and Times of Alexander Downer. So Alexander Downer, of course, a former Australian Foreign Minister, and Tony Parkinson, an author, a former political advisor to Alexander Downer, Dennis Napthine in Victoria, and to Malcolm Turnbull. So we're going to lead off with Alexander Downer, speak for about 15 minutes or thereabouts. We go to the author, and the topic is Alexander Downer, Australia's longest-serving Foreign Minister. You're welcome.
Well, thanks very much, Gerard, and it's a great pleasure to come to the Sydney Institute again. I haven't been, you're right, I don't think I've been here since I was the Foreign Minister, and that term came to an end in December. It was actually in December 2007, so it's a very long time. I've done a lot of things since then. It's kind of embarrassing to have a book written about you. I don't know whether any of you have had that experience, and I never had that experience before. There are two things to say about that. A lot of people tried to persuade me to write an autobiography, but I thought it would be bad for my mental health to sit down for 6 months and just think about myself. And I've always thought it's very unhealthy to become too obsessed with yourself. If you're feeling depressed, stop thinking about yourself. That's the advice I give my children. Anyway, Tony can explain how he came to be writing this biography as a kind of substitute for that. It isn't an authorised biography in the sense that I authorised it, but I did do many hours of interviews with Tony to explain why I believed in things, where I came from, and so on. Let me just say this. First of all, my family, it's quite well known, has been a political family for a very long time. My grandfather, who I never knew, who died in 1915, was the Premier of South Australia and was a senator and one of the authors of the Constitution. My father, though, more relevantly to today, was a member of Parliament, of Federal Parliament, when I was born. So I only knew until he retired from Parliament in 1963. I only knew life as a child with politics all around me. So as you can imagine, as children, I had 3 sisters. As children, we were made to listen to our parents regaling each other and sometimes us with stories of politics. And we had distinguished politicians of one kind or another come to visit our house. I've often said I'm one of the very few people, this is not much of a boast, by the way, but one of the very few people who has met every single leader the Liberal Party has ever had. So from Sir Robert Menzies, who was, of course, the first, and I know Susan Lee quite well. After all, I was a member of Parliament with her for 7 years. I was a member of Parliament with Susan Lee, so I know her pretty well. That was the sort of environment I grew up in, a very political environment. What would I say about that, though? Something a bit different. It's not just that I knew politicians and Sir Robert Menzies would come and stay with us and smoke cigars in my father's study. You wouldn't do that anymore, I don't think, but he lit up huge cigars and the whole house just stank of cigars for days after the great man had stayed. It's the values that I took from the discussions that I heard and subliminally absorbed the ideas that were all around me. And one of those ideas was that these people who had committed or part of their careers, perhaps in some cases most of their careers, to politics, were people who you might call nation builders. They had this idea that Australia was, and of course we would quibble with this language, but this was the language of the era. As Australia was a new nation charting a new course and was going to achieve a society which European societies and North American societies had failed to achieve. So there was an ambition for prosperity. There was an ambition for Australia being, to use a phrase, a property-owning democracy. There was an ambition for it to be an egalitarian society, a democratic society, but there was an ambition to build Australia. So we were talking earlier this evening about the importance of immigration. Well, my father was the Minister for Immigration for nearly six, not quite six. The pedant will pick me up on that somewhere, for nearly 6 years. And so this whole concept of building our population and of integrating people from different parts of the world who've had different experiences in other parts of the world into this great society, this new society of Australia, was very much part of the ambition that my father had. We were taken overseas there. That wasn't literally the first time, but the second time I went overseas, I was a 7-year-old and went with my parents. My father went to Europe to drum up migrants, to get people to migrate to Australia. He particularly wanted to get more women to come and migrate to Australia, which in later years we wondered why he was so interested in bringing women to Australia, but he was. That's what he wanted to do. He thought we were a bit short on women. But in any case, this was all part of the concept of nation building. So this was very much part of the way I saw the job of an Australian politician. And many years passed, and if you want to read the book, I should be encouraging you to buy the book, I suppose. But if you want to read the book, you'll find out what I did in all those years. But when I became a Member of Parliament, I was tremendously excited, because I thought to be a Member of Parliament was to be one of those people who could really contribute to building the nation, to nation building. I don't sort of hear very much of that anymore, and you don't have that. I mean, you may, but I don't have that sense so much coming from the Parliament anymore. Isn't the time to discuss the current political scene. But in those days, there were all sorts of ways that I thought we could improve Australia. In my maiden speech, I talked quite a lot about economics, about the need to stimulate investment, and investment would be driven by consumer choice, not driven by diktats from corporates or from corporatists or from politicians, but by the desires of consumers, and that would generate democratic growth in society. So I talked quite a lot about those kinds of concepts in my maiden speech, but I also talked about foreign policy, because my view of Australian foreign policy was always that as a country we had to try to contribute to our stable region, or a stable regional environment, as best we possibly could. And there were mechanisms we could use in order to do that. Why do I say that? Because if ever there were to be a threat to Australia, or should I say a threat again to Australia, it would come through the collapse of the security environment of the countries around us. So, I mean, almost no one here is going to agree with me about this, but I'm one of those people, very, very few people, who think that the Vietnam War may not have ended very well, but it was worth fighting, because it gave Southeast Asia 10 years in order to organise itself and stop the communist insurgencies that there were in countries like Thailand, Malaysia, as it became Singapore, Indonesia, and so on. So it generated an opportunity, and Southeast Asia took that opportunity. Had that not happened, had Southeast Asia been embroiled more generally in conflict, and there were conflicts from time to time there, then our security would have been challenged and threatened in ways that it wasn't. I always believed, and I still believe, in the importance of the American alliance. I think there's an absurd phrase that is used in Australia by particularly the political left, that we should have a more independent foreign policy. Well, just for the benefit of those people who make those kinds of statements, I was the foreign minister of this country for nearly 12 years, and never did it occur to me that our foreign policy was anything but independent. We were entirely independent. Of course, we can make all sorts of choices if we wish to do that. But I knew, and I still know, that having the United States underwriting the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region, as we now call it, the Asia-Pacific region, is fundamental to the stability and the security of that region. There's a price we pay for that alliance with the United States, and there's a price Japan and South Korea and the Philippines, all countries which in the region are allies of the United States, there's a price we do pay for that, because you can't be a one-way ally. You can't say to somebody, I'm your ally, but I'm actually going to take the alliance a la carte. If your interests are threatened, I may not bother to help you, but if my interests are threatened, I really need you to help me. So if you want really to know why we responded to 9/11 in the way that we did, and I was, of course, front and centre of doing that, we did it because we needed America to shore up its alliances with countries like Japan, Australia, South Korea, and Philippines in this part of the world by demonstrating our goodwill and support for them in their hour of need. And after 9/11, that was their hour of need. So we sent some troops to Afghanistan. As you know, we also sent troops to Iraq and helped them in Iraq. These were controversial decisions, but they were hugely appreciated by the United States and the whatever President Trump may say today, and they were hugely appreciated by the United States, and dare I say it, I don't think if we had been an a la carte ally, we had just worried about what our domestic opinion polls said in terms of the alliance, I don't think we would have ever got the free trade agreement that we got with the United States. That was a function of the United States administration being appreciative of us being a stalwart ally. Let me just repeat the point that the importance of this alliance is to underwrite the power balance in the Indo-Pacific region. So for those people who wished to move away from the United States, think about what the Indo-Pacific region would be like with the United States withdrawing from the region. You know who it would be dominated by? It would be dominated by China. And China would determine the rules of trade. It would determine the security architecture of the region. It would try to impose values that we don't share as a liberal democracy on the region. So if you're in favour of getting rid of the American alliance, you're in favour of a region which would look like that. And it would be, by the way, a very much more unstable region than we currently have. So I spent most of my time talking about that because that was a big issue for me in foreign policy. I would end by saying something else. There is a fatuous argument that liberal governments weren't interested in Asia, and it was only Labour which drove our foreign policy towards Asia. I have never heard anything more absurd. And I say that as the son of a prisoner of war of the Japanese for 3.5 years in the Changi prison of war camp. And just for your information, the Changi prison of war camp in Singapore, it's in Asia. And that's where the Australian Army was when the fall of Singapore happened. Or it's part of, not all of the Australian Army, some of the Australian Army, a couple of divisions were there. The Vietnam War was in Asia, and our contribution to that I've already discussed. The Korean War, going back a little bit further, also in Asia. No, Asia has been a preoccupation, of course, for Labour governments, but a preoccupation for Liberal governments as well. It was, after all, Sir Robert Menzies in 1957, or Sir Robert Menzies' government, that opened the door to the huge explosion of trade, Australian trade with Asia, with the 1957 Commerce Agreement with Japan. I mention those things because so much of my work was taken up dealing with issues in Asia, the Asian financial crisis, where we were the only country that supported, developed country that supported all three bailout packages for Thailand, Indonesia, and the Republic of Korea, South Korea. We had the East Timor crisis that you're familiar with. We did a lot of work in the South Pacific, working very closely with the New Zealanders, who deserve a lot of credit for this, bringing to an end the civil war in Bougainville, in Papua New Guinea. We bailed out the Solomon Islands. We helped with a massive amount of support for Asia with the tsunami, particularly for Indonesia. So this sort of notion that we weren't interested in Asia is one of the most fatuous arguments I think I have ever heard, speaking from a position of some experience. Anyway, my 15 minutes, Gerard, is very much up, and they're the points I wanted to make to you about the book. They're not here tonight, but I just want to pay tribute to my wife, Nikki. We've been married for I'm not sure how many years since no, I know our wedding anniversary is on the 17th of June. Trust me, we've sometimes been together for our wedding anniversary. At least we were for our wedding. But she has been, it's 40-something years. She has been a wonderful 45 years. She's been a wonderful support to me through all of that period. Also my sisters, Stella, Una and Angela, who you won't know Angela, she lives in the United States. She migrated there in the late 1970s. But they've always been a wonderful support. And by the way, you're wondering why I don't include my children, 4 children, in that list. No, do you know why? I have been a wonderful support to them. I paid all their school fees, helped them through university. They did very well at school, though. They got excellent ATARS scores. And they're all sort of happily ever after now. So life has been great. And I'm hoping it will go on for a little bit longer. So thank you very much. And thank you, Tony.
So now, Tony Parkinson, the author. 10, 15, okay.
Yep. Thanks very much, Alexander. Thanks so much to you, Gerard, and the Sydney Institute for hosting this event tonight. As I find myself advancing in age, and I flash my seniors card whenever I'm asked, 20 years ago doesn't seem all that long to me. It's not even the span of one generation. I think the book we're here to discuss tonight reminds us of just how much the world has changed over that time, and maybe how much we as a nation may have changed. As you've heard, this is a book about Alexander's career as Australia's longest serving Foreign Affairs Minister. It's also a book about a very different era of government, a very different approach, not only to how Australia was governed, but perhaps also in the values we adopted in our dealings with the rest of the world. You've just heard Alexander speak very elegantly and powerfully on some of those values. It was a time when policy was built on a sturdy philosophical scaffolding, where despite all the challenges of a rapidly changing world, the government brought consistency of purpose and principle to the way Australia positioned itself internationally. It was an approach grounded meticulously in hard facts and rational thinking. Alexander, like John Howard, didn't have a lot of time for the cultural vibe, for the often emotive pleadings and selective moral outrage of some in the community, what some people call the limousine left. As Foreign Affairs Minister, Downer wasn't interested in their posturing. You had to be forensic, you had to be rigorous in your assessments and firm in your convictions. Most importantly of all, he understood that protecting the political and economic freedoms Australians enjoyed at home required that we also make the case for those same values in our dealings with the wider world, that we stand up for the rule of law, that we champion democratic freedoms, and that we stand up resolutely against the intrusions and encroachments of authoritarian governments. Bear with me. Perhaps most critically of all, in the current circumstances, Australia had to reject, repudiate and resist with all the force it could muster those who supported the use of terror and violent extremism to achieve their political aims. The Howard government had its critics, and plenty of them. Some of its foreign policy choices were highly controversial and contentious. But here's the thing, after almost 12 years in power, I would argue the Howard government left Australians with a strong sense of clarity and certainty about the nation's direction and a confidence about their future. I'm not sure so many of us would say the same today. As Alexander mentioned, this is a book that could and maybe should have been written 15 years ago. And he could and should have probably written it himself. He's a talented communicator and a sharp wit and a person of very forceful opinions. And he has this treasure trove of highly illuminating anecdotes about his dealings with people in power here and overseas. Yet for all that wealth of knowledge and experience, Alexander didn't have much inclination when he left Parliament to sit down and write his own memoirs, and he hasn't since. So a little while ago, Josh Frydenberg and I had a chat about this, and we agreed it would be a shame if this story was left untold. So I took on the project, and here we are. What I set out to record in this book was an upfront account of Alexander's distinctive contribution to our national life and to our standing internationally, as a nation and as a people. Clearly, it would be a hollow exercise to attempt this biography without Alexander's direct, unflinching input I mean, I decided the themes, I chose the subject matter, I asked him the questions, but he also responded with his own reflections, observations and arguments, very plainly and forthrightly as always. He was very generous with his time, as many of you would know. He's kept himself busy since leaving Parliament. His diplomacy for the UN in Cyprus, his stint as Australia's High Commissioner in the UK, and most recently as a distinguished fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, alongside former US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. So he's very much stayed in the play with his finger on the pulse, all of which has added to an enormous bank of knowledge. So the challenge for me was to explore and explain in depth Alexander's often quite unique perspectives on why events in the world unfolded the way they did and why things are happening the way they are now. His recollections provide vivid detail on the landmark moments and some of the critical emerging trends that define the early 21st century. The September 11 terror attacks on the US and their aftermath, a resurgent, more muscular China, this fragmentation of politics we're seeing in our own Western democracies, the return of Russian expansionism in Europe, and the forlorn attempts across all those years to broker a lasting peace in the Middle East. So let me now drill down into some of the signature achievements of the Downer era of foreign policy. I would suggest the reset of relations with modern democratic Indonesia has to count among the great success stories. We have to remember the government had to work through the tremors and trauma of the East Timor crisis to support and secure independence for that tiny island nation while not rupturing relations completely with Indonesia. Then came the shock of the Bali bombings, and for all the heartbreak here in Australia, they had to get on with the job and create a new era of close cooperation on counter-terrorism with Indonesia and other neighbours in the region. So he worked painstakingly across the decade and succeeded in building far greater trust and affinity with our largest and nearest Southeast Asian neighbour than any time in our history. Alexander also spoke directly to the significant step up in the operating rhythms of the US alliance, and he's explained his reasoning for that. Less obvious, but also highly significant, was the development of much closer and deeper security ties with Japan. And that's, again, a very important element in that regional balance of power. Then there were the interventions to stop violence and bloodshed in East Timor and also later the Solomons. But there's one other that many people forget. I think Alexander mentioned it, his successful brokering of a peace deal to end the civil war over Bougainville. That conflict cost more lives in a decade than 30 years of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So bringing that to an end was a great achievement. Finally, balancing the relationships with the US and China. I think the high water mark, as I remember it, was the time that George W. Bush and Hu Jintao addressed the Australian Parliament in joint sittings on consecutive days back in 2003. It's still a really difficult juggling act, clearly, and Alexander has very strong views on how that difficult equation should be managed, and that's covered extensively across several chapters in the book. I don't want anyone to think this book is a vanilla monologue. It's not. It catalogues a lot of the criticisms of foreign policy decisions and some of the judgment calls made by Alexander. There's certainly scrutiny of those and those moments of his when his slightly outrageous sense of humour got him into trouble. I mean, Alexander's one of the first to admit that Western governments badly misread Vladimir Putin. We discussed in the book how in the euphoria of the immediate Cold War period, the Western alliance really let down its guard. In the early 1990s, they signed the treaties of Bucharest and Budapest with the Russians and then assumed the future of Eastern Europe as a free and democratic region was a done deal. The lessons of previous generations were seemingly put into cold storage. As T.S. Eliot once wrote, it was in a very different context, but he said, we had the experience but missed the meaning. And I think that proved a very dangerous miscalculation. Alexander got on okay with Sergei Lavrov, who was the long-time and remains the long-time foreign minister of Russia. But the dialogue became surlier as time went on. Alexander met Putin formally in person at the APEC summit here in Sydney in 2007. It left him in no doubt that Putin spelt trouble. He found him cold and calculating, as he put it, as cold as a winter's day in Moscow. A year later, Putin sent his tanks into Georgia. Then he reinserted Russia into the Middle East by backing up the murderous Syrian tyrant Bashar al-Assad. And then in 2014 came the annexation of Crimea, and of course in 2022 the bloodshed, the bloodbath in Ukraine. All along, the NATO powers seemed unable or unwilling to summon the willpower to confront Putin or to get the right threat assessment. And this book goes to the broader story of when, where and how the Western Alliance seemed to lose its mojo, the capacity and willpower to stand up to those whose actions jeopardise global security. Sure, yeah. Alexander, well, people may agree or disagree with some elements of the narrative in this book. They can and will question some of the judgment calls. But again, I think one advantage of this book being published now is that it allows for a longer range view. And Alexander can discuss judgments now, as he does in the book, that he might not have been comfortable discussing quite as openly at the time. He can be very candid. That's in his nature. John Howard talks about that in the book. He liked Alexander a lot for several reasons. Loyalty and a strong sense of shared values and convictions were obviously important to him. But another of Alexander's qualities, as John Howard puts it, was that Downer was always game to say what others were not. And true to form, this book contains some very blunt appraisals. So with that teaser, I thank all of you for being with us tonight.
Thanks, Tony. So we come to questions and discussion, and as I mentioned to start with, The Step to the Right, The Life and Times of Alexander Downer by Tony Parkinson has been sold here tonight, and I'm sure both our speakers would sign it. And so we'll have questions and discussion broadly on the topic. Tony finished a bit quicker tonight than he intended, but his paper will be published in full in the Sydney papers when that comes out, not so long in the future. And so let's get the two speakers up here. Can I just start with Alexander Downer? You appear on Sky News on the Kenny Report every now and then. What's a regular slot?
Every week.
Every week. But what do we have a day?
Thursday.
Thursday, yeah.
Tomorrow night.
I watch it. And on that, I think you said that there was, and Tony ends up talking about this, you said there were some parts of the book you didn't agree with. Now, everyone's going to be brief tonight, so that's a brief question, a brief answer. What did you disagree with?
Well, I'm not sure. You know, the book contains some criticism of me. I'm not sure that disagreeing with the criticisms of me is quite the way I would look at it. I mean, some people think I wasn't very good as the leader of the opposition. Do I agree with that or disagree with it? Actually, I think in truth I pretty much do agree with it. You know, there have been incidents which the left have really focused on, which haven't fussed me too much, but one of them was the stocking stunt, which I did for a charitable fundraiser. I mean, I thought I was doing the right thing, and it was sort of slightly amusing. It showed that I was a human being, you know, a good-natured human being. That may have been a political mistake, I'm not sure. I think in my electorate, I won 5 elections after that. And that seat is not held by the Liberal Party anymore. So I'm not sure if it was so much a mistake, but that's a criticism.
There was a pile-on by the cultural left over that episode. The Labor Party, of course, had a lot of fun with it, with all the jibes about cross-dressing and you know what. But they also featured a character based on Alexander in the stage show known as Keating the Musical, and stockings and all. And Alexander, well, I think he's quite magnanimous about this. He went along to the show to just to see what all the fuss was about, and he actually quite enjoyed it. But as he said at the time, Keating the Musical was certainly an improvement on Keating the Prime Minister.
He does have good legs. Andrew?
Any regrets? What would you have done differently? And your sister, Stella the Seller, is one of the great art dealers of this town. How do you get on with your siblings?
Well, I love my siblings. We all get on very well. I'm staying with another one, not with Stella, with Una tonight. Yeah, and
Any regrets? What would you have done differently?
Regrets.
Any regrets? Never really thought about these questions because, I regret some of the things I said. It's much more in my private life that I have regrets. So getting angry with people. Just listening to me here, you can't imagine me getting terribly angry, can you? But I can. And it's completely unproductive. I remember once with Chris Kenny, who was my chief of staff at the time. We were in Perth. We had to get were you there?
I was there that day, yeah.
We had to get a com car to the ABC studio to get a roasting from the ABC. I never minded that. I gave it back as good as they dished it out.
It's Kerry O'Brien, I think.
Anyway, the car wasn't there. The com car to take me to the studio wasn't there. And Chris Kenny had sent the car away. And I just exploded at him because, I was really wound up to do this interview, thinking up my lines, brilliant counter-arguments that I would put. And the effing car wasn't there. And I absolutely shouted at him. When we finally got underway, he turned to me and he said, "Look, stop shouting at me. It's not going to achieve anything." And I said to him, "You're completely wrong. It makes me feel better." So I regret it. I don't regret big decisions that we made. So like, for example, going to Iraq, I have no regrets about that. Iraq is now a struggling liberal democracy and is substantially more prosperous than it was back then in 2003. So I have no regrets about that.
Graham?
Mr. Downer, thank you. Would you have a comment on China and the South Pacific? We've seen the Port of Darwin, we've seen Dalton Road in Victoria and spreading through the South Pacific. Any comments on that influence?
So my approach to the South Pacific was that this is Australia's backyard. And we have, whether people like it or not, a huge responsibility, if you like, to use an old-fashioned phrase, as the metropolitan power of the region, to keep the region stable and to try to keep it prosperous. So we fixed up the Bougainville Civil War with the New Zealanders. They deserve a lot of credit for that. We stopped what could have descended into a very ugly civil war in the Solomon Islands by sending in the Regional Assistance Mission for the Solomon Islands. We helped out Tonga when there was some burning of shops and instability there. We tried to put Fiji back onto the path. I mention all of those things because we were forever active in the South Pacific. We abolished the position that Keating had of a junior minister for Pacific Affairs, because I took the view the foreign minister should be responsible for Pacific Affairs, not her or his offsider. So I mention all of those things because that didn't leave space for China. And the problem has been where we have not focused so much on the Pacific, that's left opportunities for China to become engaged and involved, and they use money to do that.
Darwin, big mistake.
No, that didn't happen in our time.
So hang on, in case it wasn't picked up, it was a question about the port of Darwin.
A mistake, for sure. We need to understand that on the one hand we must coexist with China, and that means having some mutual investment. But as I used to say to the Chinese, when they complained that we might place some restrictions on their investment in Australia, you've got to understand when it comes to our critical national infrastructure, we want to be very careful about foreigners investing in that. And I used to say to them, I mean, you can't complain. You don't let our companies invest in your critical national infrastructure. I mean, Telstra doesn't run the telephone system in China. Yeah, I mean, you laugh because it's an absurdity, according to the Chinese. But I'm not sure whether their system would work better if Telstra ran it or not. I'm again very, very careful about that. I'm not a Telstra shareholder. But I mean, as dealing with China is being frank with China and not being weak. Not being weak. That is the message I have for modern day politicians. Don't be weak. Just say to them, we want to coexist with you. We're not going to go to war with China, but we absolutely are going to defend our national interest and our national values, and make sure you understand that.
Okay, here we go.
Good afternoon. Oh, sorry. This isn't about people, but I'm very concerned about our country, as I'm sure most of us are, regarding our security system. We don't have people like you or the dear Jim Molan in government anymore. Do we know if there is anyone in the back burner who is going to be enrolled who has that kind of experience like yourself and Jim Molan? Because it seems like there's nobody on any side.
We're going to be very, very brief on this because a lot of people are around. Just a very quick response. And then I've got
people who've retired always look better than the people who are dealing with it today. We'll never have another Menzies. Probably not, actually. Menzies and Howard are our greatest prime ministers. But we've got to encourage people to understand that there is no greater way to serve your nation than in its national parliament and being part of its national government. So, you know, you need the best and the brightest to at least think that. And the political parties need to make sure their pre-selection processes are free of factionalism and that the best candidates think they have a chance of winning pre-selection and winning the seat. If you're not, I don't know how many of you are members of the Liberal or the Labour Party, but so often you see very good candidates losing pre-selection because they're not in the X or Y faction. It's disgraceful. It's unpatriotic to behave like that. So we need to, and then people say, well, I'm not getting involved in factionalism, so I mean, I'd have to do that to get into Parliament, so I'm never going to bother. And that's a very sad thing.
okay.
I'd like to go back to the book. Tony, you've written about someone who's alive and someone you knew. Can you tell us a bit about you and Alexander? How well have you known him, and how was it then doing a book on him when you know someone as well as you do?
Well, I worked with Alexander for almost 3 years, I suppose. And I'd known him before because I was International Affairs Editor at The Age for about 8 years, which traversed quite a few of those early years of the Howard government. I didn't always write favourably about you, I don't think, but on issues like Iraq, I was probably pretty supportive of the position the government took. We had that interaction as well. In the years since, I did go and work for a while in Cyprus when Alexander was there, I moved obviously onto other offices as well, like Malcolm Turnbull and the Victorian government. I know it's difficult or awkward sometimes for Alexander, this whole biography thing. But I've done, this is my second biography. I did one on Jeff Kennett as well. I enjoyed working on both because they both became big, bold voices in the politics of this country. And they both had the attitude of just getting on with it and getting things done. For that reason, I think I've enjoyed the whole process both times.
Alexander, you wrote recently a excoriating article in the op-ed in the Australian about the departure by the current government from bipartisan policy in relation to the non-existent state of Palestine. Can I ask you to comment on that, but more broadly, what is the importance of having bipartisan support for all the major foreign policy initiatives that this country produces?
Can we have just a brief response, because it's, okay.
Well, I thought it was preposterous to give, in effect, Hamas such a propaganda victory. Absolutely preposterous. I thought it was one of the many shameful things that have happened in this country over the last few years. I thought it was terrible. I'm not interested in bipartisanship for the sake of it. I think bipartisanship, with Margaret Thatcher here, she was asked that question. She hated bipartisanship. I'm happy to have an argument with them. I think, the government must make the decisions, but it's good to have an argument, and it's good to think of and contemplate alternatives. One of the problems with this country in recent years is that there has been too much bipartisanship. What about climate change policy? Energy policy? What choices do the voters have? Have they really had substantial choices? I think there's virtue in choice and debate and conviction. Conviction is the thing. I'm not going to change my convictions just because some opportunist in the Labour Party wants to do something a different way. I wouldn't have gone along with the so-called recognition of the non-existent Palestinian state in the interests of bipartisanship. I thought it was a bloody outrage, and I would have totally opposed it. So that's what I think of bipartisanship. If the 12 disciples had believed in bipartisanship, well, Christianity would have never emerged. The Romans would have called the day.
Could I return to China? The Chinese ambassador has been continually using wolf warrior diplomacy and language to attack this country. What do you think that should be the Australian response to that?
If I were the foreign minister, and the present foreign minister wouldn't dare do this, but if I, the one who recognised this non-existent Palestinian state at the request of Hamas, I would call the ambassador into my office, and I would say, Ambassador, it's like this. It's bloody rude for you to be coming into our country as our guests and to be saying the sort of things that you say. And I would ask you to express yourself in a much more sensitive and less arrogant way. Because in the end, it's not going to help China's interests in Australia if you're so arrogant and high-handed towards us. You know, the Port of Darwin was his latest outburst. You know, the hell and damnation will happen for Australia if you make Chinese companies sell the Port of Darwin. Well, that's just bullshit. And he shouldn't be going around saying things like that. But, you know, you've got to talk to these people about it. The Chinese ambassador, she was a wonderful woman, actually. I'll think of her name in a second. It's gone out of my head. The Chinese ambassador, when I was the foreign minister, said, she went out to the media and said it would be a huge mistake for the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister to meet with the Dalai Lama when he comes to Australia. So what did the Dalai Lama was coming. So what did I do? I called her into my office and I said, you know, your diplomacy and Chinese diplomacy is amongst the worst I've ever seen by any country. Don't think that they're inscrutable geniuses and look at everything in the long term. They make a lot of mistakes. And I said to her, you, by going out and saying that, have made it necessary for us to meet the Dalai Lama. Because if we don't, it will look as though we're obeying the instructions of your government. So you've got to understand, you are responsible, and we will be saying this publicly if you complain anymore, you are responsible for us meeting the Dalai Lama. That's your responsibility, Ambassador. I won't say anything publicly about this, and I won't make this meeting public, but if you do start complaining again when we shake hands with the Dalai Lama, then this will all be made public. Well, not a squeak out of them. And, you know, don't be scared of them and think they're absolute geniuses and we're dunderheads and, you know, no, have more self-confidence.
I've got a question to Tony. Just a quick question, a quick answer, Tony. You went with Connor Court. Any particular reason? Did you have trouble getting your book published? It sounds pretty interesting.
I won't say I'm aggrieved, but I think most people have detected a cultural trend in this country whereby when you go into a library or a bookshop, it seems that bookshelves are dominated by books about or stories about Labor governments and Labor leaders. Now, I don't know how many of you have read all 32 of the books written by or about Gough Whitlam. I haven't. I'll go with Paul Kelly's masterpiece, The Dismissal, and that was plenty for me. But it's a concerning disposition that seems to be active in some of the publishing industry and some of the wider arts and media industries. So look, I was very thankful. I mean, Connor Court is an independent publisher, quite small compared to some of the giants of the industry, and I was very thankful that they were able to take on the job.
So there's a question that wasn't picked up on the microphones. The lack of conviction in many Western countries. What do you comment on that?
Well, because I think elections and election cycles have become more professionalised. So what is happening is that the advisors, and they might be contractors, I don't mean particularly the staff of prime ministers and ministers, and in all Western countries are doing constant polling and telling them how they're going. And they are reacting to this polling the whole time. I mean, you saw that in the UK, you still see it in the UK, you see it, I mean, the Australian government, Albanese government, is a classic example of a government which it just plays politics the whole time. Everything is polled and every decision is polled, and if it's not polling very well, then they reverse the decision. You've seen this in the UK, you see it all over Europe. Rather than telling people what you think on the basis of your experience, your advice and your judgment is the right policy, their politicians have been reacting to the advice they're getting from the pollsters and you know, social media and so on. And the consequence is this is very dire, because you know what? The public know this is what they're doing. The public know they lack convictions. And so what you're seeing now is a very serious decline in trust of politicians and the political class. And I think, quite rightly so. And that's one of the reasons why the public are moving to these more populist movements. You've seen, you're seeing that in Australia, let's face it, with the strong polling support for One Nation, but you've seen it with Nigel Farage and Reform in the UK, the Le Pen phenomenon. I mean, I can keep going. You know, Georgia Maloney getting elected. And above all, Donald Trump. The thing about Donald Trump is he took over the Republican Party. You know, I mean, some people hate Donald Trump, and he gets very poor media here because the journalists hate him. But I've been spending a lot of the last 2 years in the United States. There's huge support for him there because he's seen to be, if you like, more authentic. I mean, I don't think a philosophy or ideology is easy to discern there, but he, other than, he stands up for America. Make America great again. I mean, Western politicians decry Trump for saying he would put America first. What? He should put America second or third. Behind what? Venezuela? Russia? China? I mean, this is what is happening. And the political class, by the way, the political class in the traditional political parties in Western countries, I'll exclude commentary on our own country, but the political class are entirely responsible for this phenomenon because they have created cynicism and, above all, distrust amongst the public.
Now, I've got a final brief question for both of you. Start with Tony. Let's come up, Tony. Alexander Down has admitted today that he wasn't so successful as an opposition leader, but within about a year or two he became a very strong and successful foreign minister. What do you think changed in that very brief period? Then we'll get Alexander's feeling on that.
Yeah. That first year was a bit of a baptism of fire. I mean, within days of the government winning the election here, China began firing missiles into the Taiwan Strait because they were unhappy about the democratic elections occurring there. And Bill Clinton sent warships into the region as a warning to stop China meddling. Alexander put out a statement in support of the US position, and they went right after him. The thing waged on for months. I think eventually you called it. Well, you did. You called him the ambassador again, and you said, "Look, this is going nowhere. This tit for tat. So let's set a new trajectory in which both nations can benefit from the results." And of course, that was a bit of a healing process, and trade relationship went gangbusters from there. So it was quite tough. And then there was also the Stockings photo came out that year. So some of Alexander's colleagues weren't that happy about it, and they went to the PM and said, "Can we get rid of him? He's in that job anyway. He's too frivolous." And Howard said, "No, I'm sticking with him. I think he's very good." And once you got through that year, it was strength to strength from there, wasn't it?
Final comment, Alexander? How do you assess yourself?
And I don't think anybody can ever assess themselves. I am an enthusiast for hard work. So I don't like the idea, as I get into my 70s, I don't like the idea of retiring. So I assess myself as an enthusiast and as a worker. You can't assess yourself. It's impossible. You can read the book and draw your own conclusions.
So many thanks to both our speakers for an amusing and informative night. We've got copies of the book here. I'm sure Alexander would be happy to sign them, in addition to the author, Tony Parkinson. But for tonight, thanks to both of you for a great night, and we'd love to have you back sometime in the future for whatever. Okay.